This morning. And then as we've been doing this summer, we've been sort of listening to a lot of stories of faith. We've been talking about stories of faith from Scripture, but what's been really fun is to hear stories of how faith is playing itself out in our congregation. And so we're going to do that again this morning, and I'm going to invite up a couple gals, Janet and Christina. They're going to come and share. Okay, this works over here. So go ahead, ladies, you can come on up. Whoever gets here first, you are the winner today.
You know what? Just get it done, right?
Yeah.
So, come on, friend, stand with me. So for those of you who have to do this, my best friend tells me that it's proven that if you hold something green in your hand, it helps you not be so nervous. So I'll pass this off to you when I'm done. Green bracelet. Guys, you probably don't want something sparkly green, but anyway. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Janet Ledbetter. And let me find my notes here. Heaven help me, please don't die. I want to talk to you today about someone who I believe surrounds this church community and probably everyone she meets with faith. And that's Dana Smith. Don't look at me because I'll cry. If you haven't had the privilege of meeting Dana Smith, it's probably your first Sunday here. Stick around, she'll find you. I can't go into her story, but if you don't know it, you should ask her. And for those of us who do know it, you know that her background, she spent some time in some pretty dark places. And, but despite that, she encourages me. Stop. And so many others in our community, not just in our church congregation, but outside these walls as well. She recently started a homeless ministry. And I had been on a camping trip with my nieces and nephews, had some leftover food, called her over to the house, she came and got it. And she was so excited to have cheese and chips and stuff to make sandwich with, to feed the homeless. I mean, it's just such a blessing and such a testimony of her faithfulness. But it's not just that. Everywhere I see Dana, she is all about Jesus. To have been through the stuff that she's been through and to be where she is today is nothing short of a miracle. And it speaks volumes to the truth of God's faithfulness to us. And not to all of us. She told me that same day, she said, I am just glad to be free. I'm just glad to be free. And we are free. All of us are free. He has broken every chain that binds us. And I am so grateful for that. And she never stops. She's always talking about Jesus to someone and loving him. Stop. And when the day comes that she finally meets her Lord, there is no doubt in my mind that he will look at her and say, well done, good and faithful servant.
My name is Christina Harder, and I wanted to share this morning about a special friend of mine, Cassie Falk. Cassie and I have shared life together for quite a while. We've been in community group about 12 years, over 12 years really, before either of us had kids. Those of you that know Cassie know she's soft-spoken. She's basically the epitome of sweet. She's an amazing kindergarten teacher. She's tender, kind, helpful, willing to serve, all those things. When I think of Cassie, though, I think of quiet strength, because underneath all that sweetness is an unbelievably strong faith that is just full of humility. We were pregnant at the same time with Rachel and with Jonathan, and I remember being in the hospital with her as her newborn Jonathan was taken to undergo heart surgery. And even then, she had this calming presence about her. She knew without a doubt who was in control. And she trusted God completely, no matter what the outcome was going to be with him. And I believe Cassie's unwavering faith is a byproduct of the humility that she possesses. She understands that she is a broken vessel. And because of that, Christ is able to shine through those cracks. And God is able to use her because she knows how much she needs him. 2 Corinthians 12:10 says, That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And Cassie is a great listener. She's a great encourager. She has been to me over the years, and I know to lots of other people. She loves my kids like they're her own. I'm so grateful for her, and I look forward to continuing sharing life with her for many more years. Finally, here's an analogy I had. In our subdivision, we do a garage sale every year in our neighborhood. And it always falls on Mother's Day weekend. Imagine that. That doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's when it happens. So, but anyways, this year I was looking for some boxes to put some books in, about a couple dozen books in. And I needed a certain size, and I found like a flimsy box that was the right size, but then I found another box that was the same size, but it was sturdy. And the flimsy one was prettier. I mean, it was not beat up, but its character was really weak. The other box, it had kind of torn around the edges, was a little battered, but its character was sturdy and strong. And I don't know, to me, the sturdy box, it made me think of those people in my life who have that faith-building influence on me. And most of them have shown wear and tear from their journeys, but they're sturdy in character, just like that box was. And so God can use them to bless and help and serve others. And Cass is definitely a sturdy box. So anyways, I could go on and on, but time is short. But if you guys don't know Cassie, get to know her. She's amazing.
Yeah, you hear the theme of faith in God that perseveres through hard things. I mean, that showed up in both those stories. That faith that perseveres, that's sort of the theme that we've been studying as we've been looking through Hebrews chapter 11, is faith perseveres. And you can see it from generation to generation, from the ancient saints of old, even through to today. Faith, it endures, it perseveres. God gives us what we need to hang on through what we're going through. And we're going to get into Hebrews 11 again, but before we do, I want you to grab a pen. There's a pen in the seat in front of you, or maybe you brought your own. Grab your worship guide. There's a side of that that's blank. We usually keep that blank in case God says something to your heart while you're listening or while you're worshiping or something. If you didn't grab one of those, there's a communication card somewhere just for you to write something down. This will never be seen by anybody else. This is just for you. But as we sort of get started, I think it'll help if we've done a little bit of reflection ahead of time and sort of identified a few things. And so what I want us to identify are some of the things that we love. Okay? The things where your affection goes, what you cherish, the things you delight in. I'm going to name a few different categories, and I want you to write down a specific name or a specific thing. Oh yeah, sorry. Before we do that, I forgot to dismiss the kids. Thank you for the... I should have just kept going, see how long until you actually have to come up here. All right, so let's say this blessing together, and we'll get the kids out, and then I'll get us back into what we're doing. Children, Jesus is the Son of God and has power over everything. May you always look to Him when you need help. All right, kids, you can head off to your classes. The kids were so engaged. They were so ready to write down everything. All right, so you got your pen and paper. We're writing down some of these things that we love. You know, God, He's the giver of all good things. And so He fills our lives with things we really love, which are good. And so I just want us to identify. So first, write down some of the people that you really love. You don't have to write their whole names. You can just write initials if you want. If you're not going to put the person next to you, just cover up your work so they know that they're not really on that list. Obviously, you can't write everybody, but just put some of the people that you really value most, like their welfare matters to you. You can't put parents, you don't have to put all your kids. You can just put your favorites if you want. This is probably the easiest category. We can pretty quickly identify the people that really matter to us. Okay, the next category, this one you'll probably know the answer right away, but you may be a little bit hesitant to even write it down. this is write down some sort of talent or skill or gifting that you have that you most value in yourself. What you can do that sort of makes you you. A skill that you love that you can do. And this isn't prideful. This is just being honest. A way that God's made you that you love. Write that down. Another way you might come at it is, what would you really miss if you couldn't do it anymore? All right, next sort of category. Think about a possession that you love owning. Maybe it's something that's connected to a favorite hobby of yours. Maybe someone special gave it to you. Maybe it's some sort of family heirloom. Maybe it could be your house or your car, whatever. Something that you really love, that you cherish, that you own. And one more. This may not be as easy, but write down a dream that you think about a lot. Some sort of vision for the future. You spend a lot of your time thinking about this. So maybe it's finishing that degree, or it's making that investment, or starting that business, or starting a new ministry. It could be that marriage you want to have, or traveling to that place, or doing some sort of update on your house. Some dream that you have that you find yourself thinking about a lot. Write that down. Now, sort of hang on to this list. We're going to come back to it at several points throughout this morning, but let's think for a second how God sort of designed things. When God created the world, before he created man and woman, he created a world that was full, a world that would sustain them, and a world that they could enjoy. And if you look back at the Genesis account, this world that God created, full of all these different things, they were simply that. They were things. Things that were meant to be external to the man and woman, and to sustain them, for them to enjoy and delight in, but they were always supposed to be separate from them. Supposed to be even subservient to them. There was supposed to be a distinction. And then deep in the heart of the first man and woman was this shrine, this temple, this place where only God was supposed to be allowed to enter. And when God fully was there and all these gifts out here were there to be enjoyed, there was perfect harmony. Everything was sort of in its proper place. And the result, I was thinking about like an orchestra or a good band, where everyone's looking at the same music and everyone's following the same conductor, and it's just beautiful. There's harmony, there's peace, everything's in its proper place. That's sort of how it was like. God alone, with no rivals, ruled in that inner shrine and in them, and they enjoyed all his wonderful gifts. But then sin sort of came into the picture. And when sin came into the picture, it did lots of things. But one of the things it did that I want us to talk about this morning is it enabled these things, created things that were external, to sort of allow them to creep their way into that inner shrine where he alone was supposed to exist. And when that happened, all sorts of devastating things occurred. I mean, our troubles began when God was forced out of his central place, and these created things were allowed to enter. Now, like that orchestra, nobody's looking at the same music. There's no conductor. It's chaos. It's disorder. There's no harmony. There's no beauty. Now, inside of all of us, there's this battle raging, and that's not just a metaphor. This is sort of the accurate spiritual reality for all of us. There's this inner battle of what's going to rule in our hearts. And, long gone are those days when God existed with no rival. There's all sorts of things fighting for first place in our lives. You've probably heard the famous quote from St. Augustine, or Augustine, as some people say. It's quoted centuries later because it really rings true with our experience. He said, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it finds rest in you." God's created us to sort of center ourselves on Him. But as long as we're chasing all these other things, there is no rest. There is no peace. There's no satisfaction. Last Saturday, my wife and I, we spent most of the day pulling out weeds. Something you have to do at your homes from time to time. Not my favorite activity. I could barely stand up the next day. Everyone knows when you pull out a weed, you have to get it by the roots, right? Or you're just going to sort of break off the head and it's going to be back in a day. So you have to pull it by the roots. And some of these, I was amazed. The weed was only like this tall, but you pull it up and the root would go like 12 inches down. I just sort of got thinking about that. Like, each of us have roots. I mean, you can't see them, but they sort of go deep down in, and they have to wrap themselves around something. It's true for all of us. And so what's happened is we've sort of made a substitution from the Creator, wrapping our roots around Him and sort of centering our lives on Him. Well, now we make a substitution and we wrap our roots around some of these created things, the people in our lives, or some of the gifts and talents that God's given us, our possessions. And it's almost hard to even notice that it happens because it's so natural and it's so subtle. I've been thinking about this and calling it shrine disease. When all these created things make their way into this inner shrine inside of us. And there's very noticeable symptoms of shrine disease. One of the symptoms is probably the one Augustine mentions, this restlessness, this dissatisfaction. Nothing can satisfy us truly except for God, and yet we keep believing this lie that it's just a little bit more. If I can have a little bit more, maybe if I can just have that one good friend, or maybe I'm not married to the right person, or maybe if I had a job that really appreciated my talents, or you could see how this goes. It's just this drive for a little bit more, this restlessness. A symptom of shrine disease. Anxiety, worry, fear. They often come from this because your soul is possessing things that weren't meant to be there, that you have no control over, so there's no chance of not having anxiety. Other telltale signs: control, manipulation, greed, excessive grief. We experience these emotions because deep in our heart, created things have been allowed to enter that were never meant to be there. I've noticed in myself a very consistent pattern. And, I struggle with shrine disease like we all do. And I've noticed that whenever I move into like a new group of people, I get a lot of times these very uneasy feelings, this restlessness. And, it happened when I went to college, left sort of all the high school friends and went to college, new people. It happened when we moved to Ohio, and all of a sudden in a brand new community. Even this last year moving here. And I'm sort of painfully aware in those moments of how much my identity is sort of based on my own abilities and skills and things like that. A very performance-oriented identity. And so when I'm in a new group of people, they don't know all of those skills and things, and it's just unsettling. I'm not proud of it, but I sort of become painfully aware in those moments, man, my identity, it's not centered only on God. It's also centered on some of these gifts and some of these talents and shrine disease. We all have it. And Jesus spoke to this problem. He didn't call it shrine disease, but he knows the human heart. And he spoke to this. On 2 occasions, he addressed it, and in what are often some difficult passages to really even understand. The first comes from the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:3. He says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And you've probably looked at that before and like, well, I don't know what he's talking about. The poor in spirit. He's not talking about being poor materially, like owning a lot of things. He's talking about being poor spiritually, meaning have created things made their way into our souls, our identities. He's saying you are blessed when your soul is poor, when there's nothing else in there but God alone. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The other passage I'm thinking about is Matthew 16, when Jesus says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. It seems like Jesus is saying there's an enemy inside each of us. It's this possessiveness. He calls it life. He calls it the self. And the chief characteristic is this possessiveness. I think that's what he's getting at when he's talking about saving and losing. Inside each of us, there's this thing that just wants to possess. And if we allow this enemy to live, ultimately we're going to lose everything, Jesus says. But if we reject this sort of possessiveness, if we let go of everything, ultimately you'll actually find everything you really want from an eternal perspective. And Jesus even gives us a hint of how you go about this. He says, take up your cross and deny yourself. I was reading A.W. Tozer, who talks about this sort of soul poverty, and he comments on these passages. I put it up there. There's a lot there. Hopefully you can still read it. He says, the way to deeper knowledge of God is through the lonely valleys of soul poverty and abnegation of all things, rejecting all things. The blessed ones who possess the kingdom are they who have rejected every external thing and have rooted from their hearts all sense of possessing. They are the poor in spirit. They have reached an inward state paralleling the outward circumstances of the common beggar in the streets of Jerusalem. That is what the word poor, as Christ used it, actually means. These blessed poor are no longer slaves to the tyranny of things. They have broken the yoke of the oppressor. And this they have done not by fighting, but by surrendering. Though free from all sense of possessing, they yet possess all things. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Sort of rejecting these created things, not allowing them to enter into that inner shrine that we have, not allowing our identities to be made on the created, but rather on the Creator. And I want us to, well, before we go there, that's sort of why I had us write down those things at the beginning. Because those are good things. All of those, the people in your life, the possessions you have, the gifts God's given you, the talents, the dreams He's given you, those are good things. But my guess is, if we look at the list that we wrote, some of those things aren't external to us anymore. But they've sort of crept their way into our hearts, into like our identities. Like who we are is sort of based on some of those. So I wanted us just to sort of surface that. Now, we'll keep looking at that, but a perfect illustration of this, and this is sort of how I even got here, is the story we're going to look at in Abraham's life. Hebrews 11 spends a decent amount of time on Abraham. He's got like 8 verses out of the 40. And 3 of those verses in that chapter have to do with one particular instance in Abraham's life, which really gets to this idea of soul poverty and the need for God alone to rule in our hearts. So turn with me to Genesis chapter 2, or 22, sorry. We're going to look at this. It's a very famous story of Abraham with his son Isaac. As we saw last week, when we started talking about Abraham and Sarah, Abraham is quite old by the time Isaac's finally born. He's old enough to be his grandfather, not his father. So it's pretty easy to imagine that as soon as Isaac is born, that Abraham's in love. And it's pretty easy to see how Isaac becomes sort of the idol of his heart. I mean, he had waited 75 years for this child. And now here he is, and I'm sure from the first time he stooped down and held his tiny little body, I'm sure he was in love. And it was an intensely fierce love. The Bible, especially in narrative parts, doesn't usually use very flowery language. But God goes out of his way to comment on the strength of Abraham's love. Look at verse 2 in chapter 22. He says, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah." It's not hard to understand why Abraham really loves this child. I mean, he represented everything that was sacred, everything that was precious to Abraham. The promises of God, the covenants, his longing and yearning for a child, even the messianic dream, all of that was wrapped up in this child. It's not hard to see why Abraham was so in love with his son. But that relationship sort of bordered on the idolatrous. To Abraham, Isaac had sort of moved from a gift to be enjoyed, something to be cared for, inside, into that central place where God wanted to reign alone. And so God steps in. God steps in to save both the Father and the Son from this uncleansed love and the consequences that would come from it. So, verse 2. Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on the mountain I will show you. Sacrifice your only son. Now, we are sort of spared an up-close view of what the agony that Abraham went through as he considered doing what God asked him to do. We don't really see that in here of what he went through, but it's not hard to sort of imagine how passionately Abraham must have wrestled in prayer with God over the life of his son. I mean, he was probably up for hours, weeping and praying and asking God for another way. In fact, it wasn't until the one greater than Abraham wrestled in the Garden of Gethsemane that any human soul ever felt such intense pain. I'm sure Abraham thought over and over, God, why don't you just let me die instead? That would be 1,000 times easier. I'm old. I've walked with you for a long time. Why don't we just trade places? In fact, it probably would have been a great joy for Abraham, for the last thing his eyes to see as he was dying is his strong son, who's the representation of his line carrying on and all of the promises that God's made. But how could he kill his own son? Even if he could get his sort of wounded and aching heart to go through with it, how could he reconcile the fact that God's asking him to kill his son with the promises that all of the promises of God are going to come through Isaac? How could he reconcile the two of those? It seemed like God was asking him to do the very thing that would negate those promises. So this was Abraham's trial by fire. I mean, what is he going to do? Where are his true loyalties? Would he follow God unreservedly without any reservations? Or is he going to sort of make excuses and preserve his true love, his son? God was sort of pulling Abraham, and his roots were getting caught. And God was wondering, what really are your roots attached to? And his faith was stretched to the max, but it didn't break. And in those wee hours of the morning, when he was wrestling with God in prayer, long before any glimpse of the sun coming up, Abraham made up his mind. He would do it. He would offer up his son as God had told him to do, and he would trust that after he did that, God would raise him from the dead. That's sort of how he worked it out. We know that because in Hebrews 11, the author tells us this: Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. So Abraham said, I don't quite get this. You're asking me to kill my son, and yet I know your promises are going to come through him. So you must be preparing to do the miraculous. So I'm going to obey you, and I'm going to trust that you're going to raise him from the dead. I mean, that is faith. That's why the author of Hebrews brings him up, because that is incredible faith. Faith that goes way beyond understanding. So early in the morning, Abraham got up, and he set off to obey God. Now, Abraham wasn't exactly right about what God was going to do. He didn't quite have God's method all worked out. But he did sort of guess God's heart in this. He heard that God was calling him to let go. God was calling him to release his grip on Isaac. His roots had gotten too much wrapped around his own son. His identity was sort of there. Isaac had moved into that central shrine in his heart, and God was asking him to let go, to release him, and he obeyed. And God let this suffering old man go through it, the whole thing, all the way up until the point where there was no retreat. And it was at that moment that God stopped him and said, no, don't touch the man. And I'm sure Abraham was quite confused, but then God said in that moment, in effect, he said, Abraham, I was never actually going to have you harm your son. What I wanted was to remove him from the temple of your heart. I want to reign there with no rival. I want to correct that perversion that was in your love. So now you can have your son back, safe and sound. Take him, go back to your tent. Now I know that you fear God. That's sort of what God says to him in verse 16. He says, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies. And through your offspring, all nations of the earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me. And then Abraham, he sort of lifts his head to worship God. And in that moment, you have this picture of this man who's strong and who's pure and who's been refined. And he's wholly devoted to the Lord. He's utterly obedient. Abraham possesses nothing. He's poor in spirit. I mean, before this incident, Isaac had crept into his heart and was dwelling there. But then God sort of definitively removed him. And I find it interesting, God doesn't start at sort of the outside of Abraham's life. I'm sure there were other things that had sort of made their way into Abraham's life. I mean, he had a wife, he had a lot of possessions. God doesn't start with those sort of margins. He went right for the center and said, I'm going to deal with the center. And in dealing with that, he dealt with all of it. Abraham possessed nothing. Yet we know from Scripture he was quite wealthy. He had wife, he had servants, he had lots of goods, and on top of all of it, he still had Isaac safe by his side. All of those were gifts for him to enjoy, yet nothing, he didn't possess anything at that soul level. Now he could care for them and enjoy them. They'd been cast out of his heart. This shrine disease, this urge to possess. We all struggle with it. It's a harmful habit. It's really so tricky because it's subtle. So what are we supposed to do? Well, as a start, one of the things we can do is sort of take inventory and just be really honest. Look at your own life and say, where is my identity based on? And this isn't a time to sort of make excuses or play games with God. I mean, he knows us inside and out. He knows what really is in our heart better than we do. It's a time just to be honest and sort of identify, that sort of crept in, and that's crept in, and that person, that. Just to be really honest and take inventory. And then I think we just need to come to God with our need and sort of ask him to do that removal. And this won't be a general prayer. This is going to be a very specific prayer where we name people and we name specific things that we've sort of identified. And we ask God to go to work. We ask him for his help to remove those things so that he alone can exist in our heart. Now, this is a risky prayer. It's probably it's a painful thing whenever something on the inside of us has to come out. Even this morning, I was taking a splinter out of my heel. It was a tiny little splinter. It hurt like the dickens getting it out of there. But something that's much deeper at the soul level, that's going to hurt a lot more. I mean, imagine the agony Abraham went through. That's what it took for God to remove Isaac from his heart. We got to ask God. And then I think we just have to wrestle in faith. This isn't sort of a truth that we just sort of learn in our heads and then sort of apply it. We ask God, and then we sort of hang on as he takes us through life experience. The experiences he leads us to, often are his answer to that prayer. And so we have to sort of hang on when he takes us through some sort of trial or some sort of hard thing that Abraham had to go through to purify us, to cleanse us.